Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining me tonight, or really just gentlemen. I think Beckett's going to probably get on in a little bit. But either way,
They're
thank
probably
you.
ladies out in the streaming world.
Yeah, people don't really watch these like as we are going live. So, future ladies, you know what? That sounds weirder. I'm just
Yeah,
gonna
clean up your
continue
act.
on. Just, yeah.
Assume
Uh,
everybody knows what's going on.
um, Thank you for joining me for our April listening club. I almost forgot that we were having this tonight because it's so much earlier in the month than I usually do these. It was just
I just
awkward
set an
timing.
alarm for it.
I woke up this morning and was like, "Great, I have nothing going on tonight." I'm glad to be talking about this album with you guys because I really, really like this album, and also I think the story behind it is also pretty interesting. But before we get started, I am going to do my little housekeeping spiel. So for most people who know us, we are with the Dragonfly Arts Creative. We are a Facebook group. So let me go ahead and add that there. It's a pretty cool Facebook group. It's a bunch of creatives, and we get together to talk about creative things. If you're in the Los Angeles area, we do like meetups, so you can actually see people in person, which is pretty nice. But even if you're not local, we do have weekly calls where we talk about, creative things that are going on and issues involving being a creative. We also just started a writing group. So if you're into writing, you can join that. We do like monthly prompts and all that. I don't know exactly how that all works yet, but all that information is in our Facebook group. We don't just do the music listening club. That's this one. We also have a monthly movie club, which will be meeting next week. And we have a quarterly book club, which is also meeting this month at the end of the month. I announce our new picks on the first of every month, so you can find those in the Facebook group as well as any of our past picks. And if you want to talk about anything that we have watched or listened to or read, please reach out to me. I really like talking about stuff. And if you like us and like what we do, you can support us on Patreon. Everything that we do is open to our Facebook group members. Everything is free unless you want to buy some pizza while we are having a meetup. But if you'd like to support us in some of the costs that get incurred, even though we are mostly online, support us for as little as $2 a month on Patreon. And I think that about covers it. So anyways, I know that Tim's very excited about this album. Let's talk about what's going on.
What's going on with you, Rebecca?
I spent a really long time reading up on this because I was like, man, I have to have my knowledge together in order to discuss this album with. But at the same time, I'm expecting you guys to fill in some of the blanks and correct me where I'm wrong. So just to go over the little bit of the basics for this album was released on May 21st of 1971. It is his 11th studio album. However, it is also the first autonomous work that was done with Motown Records, which I actually thought was the really fun part about this. Do you guys know the history of this album?
Well, when you say autonomous, you mean the first record he produced of his own?
Yes. Also the first record that they let anybody produce on their own, on their record.
Yeah. Oh, I thought Stevie Wonder did that, but yes. Cool. Yeah. Stevie kind of happened at sort of the same time. When was Stevie's first Stevie album, Tim?
The first of the series of classic albums was released the same year as this album was.
Yeah, so I think they kind of were going on simultaneously, and this one was released first.
Which was
this one was also like really popular, and I imagine it kind of like paved the way a little bit for more people being able to produce their albums. It was also a really fast turnaround time. So the backstory for this is the song What's Going On was actually released in January of the same year. Yeah, January of the same year. They didn't want this to be released, and by they, I mean
Berry Gordy.
Motown, yeah, Berry Gordy and Motown
Executives.
Records. However, there is actually like a little bit of like confusion here. It seems like the things that Berry Gordy says and the things that everybody else says don't quite mash up. So,
listen to what everybody else said.
Yeah. What's Going On was a protest song that was written not originally by Marvin Gaye. Originally, it was inspired by Ronaldo Benson of the Four Tops and was given to Al Cleveland before it made it into Marvin Gaye's hands, and he pretty much reworked it entirely from the ground up. It is originally about Bloody Thursday, when police clashed with anti-war protesters, and I think 2 people died. And he rebuilt the song with his own kind of disgust for the war going on and his own kind of he was very sad about things going on. And they did not like the song. They said that he was going to lose his audience. And so some people at Motown Records, it seems like secretly sent out a copy of it. And it's sold
to radio.
Yeah.
Interesting.
To stores.
Oh, to stores too. Wow. That would be harder than sending it out to radio.
I don't have a lot of details on this. It was just like, an interesting thing. It sold 100,000 copies before the record label found out, and then they re-released it officially, and it sold 100,000 more copies. And Berry Gordy told Marvin Gaye that if he could make an album happen to ride on the coattails of this success, that he would have full control, but he had to have it done by the end of March. So all of this is going down. This single originally came out at the end of January. So all of this is going down January, February, and he was given a month.
Wow.
So What's Going On was recorded the year before over the course of 5 days, which I think is also funny. It was recorded in what seems like it was kind of a little bit of a marijuana-fueled drinking session. Over 5 days in 1970, the rest of the album was recorded between March 17th and March 30th, including, I think, being written. And then they didn't like any of the tracks. They thought that they sounded like demos, so he re-recorded all of them on May 5th using an orchestra. Which is why there's a bunch of orchestra on this album to help redefine the protest album. Anyways, I just thought it was really funny that he wrote a song, they secretly released it, and then it was so successful that they were like, crap, you have to write more songs.
I find it amazing that any record label would not notice 100,000 copies of something going out, but at that point,
I don't know if it was. I think that it was with the help of the employees of the record labels. So I think it was less without the record label's knowledge and without Berry Gordy's.
Without the executive's knowledge. Yeah. And also they were sort of, I think, in the process of moving from Detroit to LA. So maybe the executives were in LA trying to set things up, and I don't know. But that's amazing. I didn't know that.
Gordy was he was all over the place, with the move to LA being the biggest thing.
Yeah. So I spent a lot of time today reading about that and double checking the notes. According to Berry Gordy himself, he was like, "No, I love the song."
Knows it now.
Gordy had a very limited sense of what audiences wanted to hear. He thought they wanted to keep hearing the Jackson 5 doing "I Want You Back" for the rest of eternity, and a lot of artists were chafing under that requirement. The Jackson 5 heard this album and they said, "Hey, we want to do that. We don't want to do these." Those songs were all great, but time was marching on. And Norman Whitfield was working with the Temptations at the time. Norman Whitfield kind of broached this broached the orchestration things that are going on in this when he was working with the Intruders in the late 60s. You know, eventually that all, what you hear a little bit of in this album and what Norman Whitfield was doing at the time, eventually Philadelphia guys, Leon Huff and Kenny Gamble, grabbed it all and created the idea, the concept of Philadelphia soul. You know, but this album was a key moment for R&B and pop music, and for the artists at Motown. You are correct. Stevie Wonder did produce his album. He was co-producing some of his albums, but the album that he released just prior to the Classic Four are Music of My Mind, Talking Book, Intervisions, and Fulfilling This First Finale. But he did Where I'm Coming From, which was released the same year as this album. And he produced that. And this just kind of made Gordy really had to face that he had artists that were talented enough to do this kind of work. They could write their own songs. They could produce their own songs. They didn't need him to hold their hand and control, you know, every bit of the production as he was wont to do. He thought of Motown as what a lot of, he just thought that people wanted escapism in their music, that they didn't want to deal with the world, and the world was ready for these artists to deal with what was going on and not just do, you know, these throwaway pop songs that you know, were going to stay very much a part of their time and weren't going to last as long as this album has.
I mean, not to break out of like the music thing, but it reminds me of everything happening in the movie industry right now with A24, where A24's entire model is just let directors do their thing and tell the story they want to tell. And they have been wildly successful with that. And it's just bonkers to me that like producers have not figured it out, despite the fact that there have been just history and history and history of this working. But it's not, it doesn't work immediately. I mean, this was his 11th studio album. Like he had the build up to do something like this. But this was a huge turning point for him, as well as for like Motown and R&B and soul as a whole, because this was such a turning point for him.
Yeah, and in Berry Gordy's defense, he was dealing with more than musical and chart issues. He was like the head of the first major black-run record label that crossed over to white America, right? And yes, he had a formula for that. And yes, that was kind of based on, you know, sort of taming things down for a crossover audience, right? So he was also dealing with racial pressures, or at least what he perceived to be racial pressures of how real they could get and still cross over. And he found out with this album and then Stevie Wonder's later stuff that you can get away with a lot, but he didn't know that. So yeah, part of it is just him being a real conservative businessman, record label owner, but there's also like what's going on with crossing over into white culture in the 1960s and early 70s was like a non-trivial problem.
I think, I mean, I want to, now I don't know this for a fact, but I would be willing to bet that because white audiences did not pick up on this album. I mean, you know, it was, this album was not on white people's, in white people's radar at the time. I think what happened was that Black audiences were not necessarily buying into this continuing process of R&B artists, Motown artists just keep doing these standard, you know, they didn't want to hear My Girl from the Temptations anymore. They wanted to hear something that was more contemporary to their experiences. So I think what happened is that while Gordy lost some white audiences with this move by his artists, he also increased the amount of Black audiences that were paying attention. So because the music was now, this material spoke to them in a way that that having the Temptations do My Girl for the umpteenth time wasn't going to do. You know, and Norman Whitfield with what Norman Whitfield did with the Temptations when he took them into psychedelic soul, you know, that just really proved the point, because when they did Papa Was a Rolling Stone, there was a whole new generation of Temptation listeners that were not there when they were still doing My Girl.
I think that I have two thoughts. The first is that I always feel like this is an album that inspires people that are already in like the know a little bit. Like this is the album that inspires other artists to do things, but it's not like an album that I feel like if I call my dad up and say that we're working, like this is the album we listen to, I feel like it's not on his radar at all. I feel like he'd be like, Marvin Gaye, oh, you're listening to like some intimate romance stuff. Like,
Yeah. I mean,
the other part of this that I think about a lot is that if I listened to this album and didn't pay attention to the music of it, like, or the lyrics of it, it would still be kind of like happy soul music. Like, I don't know if I would necessarily like correlate it to like political discourse unless I was paying, like, if I didn't know English.
Oh, the music goes down like butter. The music goes down like butter.
But I think the music was also a bit revolutionary in a popular song context, just because of all the jazz influences and the soul jazz, like Ramsey Lewis kind of stuff that's in there. So while it now to us doesn't sound that groundbreaking, I think at the time, especially on pop radio, I don't think you were hearing music like that, you know? And again, you know, most of, I mean, having grown up in the, you know, mid to late 70s, or started listening to a lot of music and right around 73. So after this album, I had definitely heard the three hits, right? You know, What's Going On, Mercy, Mercy Me, and Inner City Blues. And so I, you know, I remember thinking that it was really different, but you know, I was young, everything was different. But I think if we look at the context of what was on the radio at the time, I think it would stand out a little more, but that's just a hunch.
I think that's completely fair. I think this is something where I am too young to fully like understand the impact of it. I spent my entire childhood listening to the things that this inspired, and that happens a lot with me when it comes to like albums along these lines. I'm trying to find like a list of like other albums that were released at the same time.
See, I hear this album and it takes me back to my childhood. That's how tightly I identify with it. And a lot of it I didn't understand at the time. Mercy, Mercy Me hit me when I heard that. That was the first tune on here that I ever picked on. It wasn't picked up on. It wasn't until, 10, 15 years later when I'm, becoming a musician and I hear Inner City Blues and I'm like, whoa, whoa. Why wasn't I paying attention to this, back when I was a kid? Because I didn't understand it. And not just musically, the lyrics, I started to, I saw, it takes me back to what I was seeing on the streets and did not understand when I was, what was I? I was 8 years old when this album came out. So, yeah, I think it hits me different because I was somewhat aware of what the world was growing up in Los Angeles at this time.
Yeah. And then conversely, I'd only heard the hits and I knew the album was a classic album, but I never listened to the whole album until yesterday.
I also think that it's important to note that on November 1st, 1971, Sly and the Family Stone released an album that, well, the album itself has nothing to do with this album. The title does, which is There's a Riot Going On, which was a direct response to this album.
Yeah.
Interestingly, recorded before Marvin Gaye recorded this album. I think the thing that's impressive to this is just like how quick the turnaround time was.
Well, yeah, yes. And then also back then you were kind of expected to crank out 3 albums a year. So quick for him, definitely, but not like lightning quick and probably not without precedent. And there were definitely people taking longer with albums who had, bigger budgets, certainly the Beatles would take longer than that. But there was still an expectation that you would do a couple, 3 albums a year if you wanted to, have a presence in the market.
I was
Yeah.
never a coherent person before the internet, so I don't know what it's
Yeah.
like to do things.
I mean, Motown, like a lot of the R&B labels, that came just before them, the labels of the 50s and the early 60s, was a singles factory. They were a hit factory, and if they hit big, then they would sell the album. But the most important thing to them was getting the singles out. So if you did, 2 great songs and then filled an album with 8 mediocre songs, that was just fine with Berry Gordy, as long as you had those singles out there that were scoring. It was all for him. It was, they were a hit factory first and foremost until this. I think
Yeah.
this is when he finally realized the value of an album and what that could bring in terms of sales.
I think also, and I think I left this out of my my little history thing, but Marvin Gaye also issued them an ultimatum. He said he wasn't going to record anything else until they allowed him to release What's Going On. So he wasn't going to record or allow them to release anything. They actually did release, I think, an album, but he didn't support the release of it.
Yeah, he didn't do it.
Yeah, he did no marketing for it, although he also wasn't touring or performing during this time. A lot of the history of this album was a huge turning point for Marvin Gaye's life. There were a lot of things going on. His marriage was dissolving. He was like dependent on cocaine at this point in time. Apparently he was having problems with the IRS.
Which you referenced in the lyrics.
Yeah.
Tammy Terrell had died also.
Yes,
so
that was the main one. That's actually why he didn't perform, and he actually didn't go on tour again until 1974.
Wow. So he didn't tour this or the album after the Let's Get It On album. Wow.
No. I think he still performed in places, but he's remained stationary, and he refused to perform as Marvin Gaye. Like, he would perform, but it would be like an opening for a different act, or I guess probably showing up somewhere, because that was a thing that people did. Sorry, I opened up too many tabs on my computer.
I'm not sure.
Closed out of all of the important ones.
I want to say that when Let's Get It On as a single came out, I think it blew everything else out of the water in terms of sales. I think it totally blew everything from this album away on sales, just from that one song, which goes back to that thing I was talking about Barry and hit singles. That his first priority was give me a hit single. And God, I remember, even I was 10 when I think Let's Get It On, or 11 when Let's Get It On came out. And even I knew the fucking tune, as a little white boy, in my Jewish neighborhood in LA. I heard that song, and it was just, you couldn't get away from it.
I think it's the one that everybody knows. I don't think, if I didn't go to college to study music, I don't think this album would be on my radar. But I actually own it on vinyl. So.
Oh, awesome. Cool.
I think I mentioned when you first posted it, when you announced it, that in my book, it's the greatest album ever recorded in any genre of music.
In a lot of books, that is the case. I
was thinking about it, because I heard Mercy, Mercy Me as a single when I was a kid, I can listen to just that track. And Inner City Blues, because I spent a lot of time working out the bass line, I can listen to that. But I can't drop the needle anywhere on this record and just do that. I have to, if it's not those 2 tunes, I have to start at What's Going On and listen to the whole bloody album all the way through, or I feel like I'm coming into the middle of a movie.
Which is kind of the case. This is a concept album. It is a song cycle. They are all connected. Each song leads into it, except for, I feel like, What's Going On, where they kind of added in the background parts of what's happening, brother, but they're not really connected. Whereas the rest of this album, if I blink, I'm already on the next song and I didn't notice. Speaking of which, I didn't do my normal question of, well, first of all,
Have
did
I
you
ever
guys
listened to
listen?
this album
Yeah,
before?
have you ever listened to this album before?
Goes without saying.
I think we've already answered that. I had never listened to the album before yesterday, not the full
Uh,
album.
do you have a
I'm
favorite song?
surprised.
Well, I
I'm
mean, I knew
surprised.
the hit singles, but I mean, when it was released, it passed me by, so I would have been discovering it in the late 70s, and then at that point, I was really sort of obsessed with Stevie Wonder.
Yeah, I guess I just thought since the Funk Brothers were playing on it, I just kind of figured you would have, gravitated to this album just kind of naturally.
Yeah, it never came up. Sorry.
Do you guys have songs that stand out to you?
That's a really weird question on an album like this because it's a song.
It's true. I had to write notes for it because I was like, oh no, I never answer this question just because I feel like I'm like keeping the conversation going, and I talk a lot during these. So
You know what? But I would, now I'm thinking about it, I would pick What's Going On, but just because of the bass line.
so fun
You want
fact
me to tell
about
the
that
story
bass line.
about the bass line tracking, or you got that?
Yeah, I have it, but you can go ahead and do it.
Okay, well, I can't. So I didn't read this. This is just what I heard. So James Jamerson was sort of the genius of the Funk Brothers of the Detroit Motown studio group. He was the bass player and just absolute, just complete genius. And people are still talking about James Jamerson in bass player circles. So I guess they wanted to record the bass track for What's Going On really late at night, and they found him at a club, and he had been drinking. He was doing a gig, but he was really drunk, and the story is that he was so drunk he couldn't sit up in a chair, so he had to lay down on the floor. They gave him his bass, and somebody held the changes, like the sheet music changes, for him to read above him, so he could read them laying on the ground. And he did this in one take, and it's just an amazing bass line. And I'm convinced Chuck Mangione created a whole song from the bass line in the bridge, sort of the wordless vocal bridge of What's Going On. Boom, bum, 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 right? That's a whole like Chuck Mangione song. Just that bass line is just stupendous. I don't think he played bass on the whole album. Did he play
He played
bass on
it
the whole
on
album?
not the
No.
whole album, but a lot of it. Well, 4 songs, which is actually quite a bit of this album. I think at least half.
Yeah.
Slightly less than half.
But oh my God. Yeah.
Everything else was Bob Babbitt.
Oh, Bob Babbitt did the other 2 hits. Yeah. And Bob Babbitt is, pretty dang, and also, to be honest, I didn't realize, I recognize a lot of the, how do you say,
One.
Funk Brothers from the lineup, but not the drummer, like Chet Forrest, I had never heard of. So
Nobody has. This one of the if you go do some research on the net, everybody says, "Who's Chuck Forrest?"
It
What is
feels
it?
like
Is
a
it
fake name.
a fake name for somebody who didn't have a contract with Motown? Who wasn't,
It
who was
feels like that.
contracted with
Chet
somebody else?
Forrest sounds like a weird name.
Anyway, but he's also not, I mean, I've only listened, the hits, I've listened to a lot, but the whole album I've listened to a lot, and there's only one spot where the drummer's, really sort of doing something super interesting. It's sort of like a really jazzy ostinato thing that he's doing on one of the tunes, not one of the 3 hits. So it's interesting. So who knows? But I'm not familiar with him, but I only know like the top 3 Detroit Motown guys, Benny Benjamin. Oh my God, I'm forgetting the other 2, but I wasn't familiar with Chet Forrest.
Okay, so I actually did a little short Google search on him and couldn't find anything like really concrete.
Wait, Becca's not here. We have to call out. There's an oboe player. Come on.
I mean, there's a
think you missed
full
that.
orchestra, so.
Yeah.
So I found this post on soulfuldetroit.com where it was somebody asking if anybody had any information about Chet Forrest. And Simon J., drummer and author researching unsung session players in 60s and 70s soul, found that his real name is Chester Philosophe, He was probably a big band and jazz drummer. Played probably in like military bands as part of the military in the 50s and early 60s, and was just a local guy that played drums.
Wow.
Probably recruited him from a jazz club somewhere. He was mainly jazz and big band, and that is the most anybody can find on him. So Chet Forrest is a fake name, but he just is some dude they found.
Wow.
Which, honestly, dope.
I think the very simplicity of how he plays is why we are able to hear what's going on in the rest of the percussion section. What you hear, you know, going on with Bobby Hall on the bongos on Inner City Blues, and what James and Bob Babbitt are doing. That's all, I think, because of the simplicity of the drum part. The drummer stays out of the way and just basically holds down the groove, and that allows, you know, these other players to just explore things that just kind of create this three-dimensional kind of thing going on in the rhythm section.
There you go.
Yeah.
What do I know?
I sent a link to that thread because there's other people talking about it. I'm not going to talk about Chet Forrest anymore on this call, but for your own reference, this is the thread that I found of this guy looking for information on him. Yeah. To go back to my thing, just because I feel like it's slightly related. Gosh darn it. I really like the Mellotron on Mercy, Mercy Me. It makes me very happy every time I hear it. But
where is that? I've heard that song 100 times and never thought there was a Mellotron on there.
At the end. Like in like the weird connection of between Mercy, Mercy Me and Right On. It's a Mellotron sequence that it's such a silly sounding instrument to me. So whenever I hear it, it's just makes me laugh. But I can't deny that I am a flute player, so Right On kind of.
Who played flute on that?
So there's two people listed as a flute player, and I can't figure out who played the flute on this. Because the way it's written in the notes, it's over. Oops. Whenever I click on it, it moves to the next slide. It's Dana Hardwick or William Pearage. And both of them have credits on other albums, including other Marvin Gaye albums. And I imagine one of them is a part of the orchestra that played, and the other one played as a soloist. And based on the small amount of research I've done, I think it's Dana Hardwick, but I don't have any confirmations or any information on that. It's just one of the two.
To me, it sounded like a jazz flautist.
I actually looked through all like the saxophone players, because if it was a saxophone player, they would say that it's a double, but it sounds like a double. Like it sounds like a saxophone player who's playing the flute.
Or who at least has a, like, you know, jazz improv sensibility, which would not be typical of string player or like an orchestra flute player, especially in the early 70s. Much more likely now, but yeah, that's interesting.
But based on like the discography that I could find for it, it matches more with like what I could find for Dana Hardwick than what I can find for William Pearage. But I don't know. They're just listed both as flute. So
they probably work around New York City with Chet Forrest.
You mean Detroit?
Detroit, wherever.
They did some of this in L.A.
Yeah, they did. That is where they recorded the orchestra after.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
This was also part of why what was going on with that, why Jamerson was in the state that he was in at the time, because as I recall, he was not thrilled about moving to Los Angeles.
Was his stuff done in LA or Detroit?
Yeah, his stuff was done in LA.
Yikes.
He had followed Berry Gordy here, I guess.
Yeah. I know he moved out. He was one of the only well, I mean, there was very few funk brothers that made the move to LA, as I understand it.
Yeah, there was a big split among the musicians who were working Motown about many of them were not like, no, I'm not moving to LA. And I think Jamerson I think Jamerson moved because he felt he had to, but he was not happy about it. I could be wrong about that, but that's how I recall the story, which is when he really started drinking a lot.
Yeah. There you go. Wow.
Sorry, I'm still going through this like list of people trying to figure out who the flute player was. I'm like, maybe I missed something because it definitely sounds like a jazz doubler.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to go back to one thing Tim talked, or one of you mentioned about this being a song cycle. So the only it's interesting that it the for me, and again, I listened to the album once, so I could change my mind listening to it a second or third time. But there's a certain sameness in the tracks in between the hits, in terms of the music. And what's interesting is, for me at least, that brings me to the lyrics, because I'm not usually a lyric guy. I'm usually the drummer sitting in back, and I never learn the lyrics until I have to sing, right? And so it's rare that I'm listening to something and I'm drawn to the lyrics right away. And I think the part of the song cycle nature of it is seems to me is as much the lyrics as the sameness of the tunes. Like all the tunes seem like, they're siblings of the same mother and father, and that was just something that struck me, is that it made the lyrics stand out. And usually when I listen to a song cycle, it's kind of like what's leading me there is the music. But here, the lyrics were leading me there. I don't know if that means anything to either of you, but
I
I
mean, it's
think during
interesting because I have the opposite effect with this, where, I mean, as Tim said earlier, the music of this goes down like butter. I feel like I blink and this album's done
yeah,
before I've even comprehended that I've started
look at that,
something.
look
So
at
I
that,
had
look
to
at that
like
album length.
really pay attention to the lyrics. Like I had to sit there and read them.
oh,
Look at that album length. Those albums go 35 is short.
Yeah.
That's like a Van Halen album.
Yeah, it's a short album, but it also, like, everything leads
Yeah.
into one another. It's very smooth. It's very nice. It is for me, I had the opposite experience where, like, once I started reading the lyrics, I was like, this is extremely clear.
yeah,
Like there is no room for interpretation on any of these lyrics, but I think the music just feels, it's almost like the lyrics are trying to say a different thing than I feel from the music at a lot of times.
oh, yeah,
And it's not like a jarring difference. It's just that like the music makes me feel very calm, and then it's somebody telling me about all the injustice in the world over it.
It's on side one, going from What's Going On to Mercy, Mercy, Mercy. It does have this feel of it's one song. Then you get to Ride On and the whole thing changes. And then the last three tunes on the album are just they're definitely three different songs. But those first three, the side one, which I think is 5 songs, it does feel very much all of a single piece. And I think the music does match the lyrics. Like there's a melancholy about the sound, and about the music, all the way up until you get to Ride On, when Ride On's very much this very, funky thing. And Inner City Blues is just a different kind of funky thing. So one of talking about it as a concept album, it's interesting the way we think of concept, or at least the way I think of concept albums. They tend to be contrived. Somebody says, okay, I'm going to do this, like Roger Waters. Roger Waters will, in a Pink Floyd album, say, okay, this is my idea, and I'm going to write a set of songs about this. But this feels more organic, like these were things that were really on Marvin Gaye's mind, that were just like, I think he's despondent, I think he's melancholy, and he's sad. And all these songs, I think, are just coming out of that experience that he was having at that particular time. So there's no contrivance in the concept of this album. It's just all, this is where Marvin's at this particular moment in time. Because
Yeah.
you look at the album that it's surrounded by, you know, the one before it and the ones that come after it, they're very different compared to this.
I think that it goes back to the fact that this album was pretty much recorded over the course of like 2 weeks. Like,
Yeah,
he was in a very
that
specific
tracks.
state of mind.
Mhm.
I also wanted to talk about the state of mind that he was in, just because I have this other little funny tidbit of a fact of he was going through a lot of changes. I mean, we were talking about this earlier. Like, he kind of felt like his life was falling apart. He was struggling with the death of Tammy Terrell, who was his singing partner. Which I didn't realize how many of their tracks that I knew together. Like, I feel like I never heard the name Tammy Terrell until I started researching for this album, but like, I know her voice very well.
Yeah, I don't think she did. I don't think she sold a lot of records outside of the duets with Marvin.
Yeah, she was also very young when she died, unfortunately. She died from a brain tumor at 24.
Yeah,
So I would be really interested to see like where she would have gone as an artist had she survived. But between everything that was going on, he kind of was very despondent, refused to leave his apartment, and at one point in time decided to pursue a career in football.
that's nuts. When I read that,
He including training with college football teams,
yeah,
and he was denied tryouts because the owner of the Detroit Lions, who he was trying out for, knew his music and thought that any football injuries would hurt his music career, and he wanted him to continue making music.
yeah. I don't see him as a football player, but that's interesting.
Well, he was also 32 when this album came out, which is
Which
pretty
is
late
nuts.
career,
That's
but
like retirement age in the football, right?
but then I also had to think about like, this is 1970 where all this is going on, and like, I don't know the age of like football players in the 1970s. I don't
It
think
was
it's a
retirement age back then because there was less sports medical technology wasn't as advanced as it is now. I did want to go back to something Tim said before. So people talk about this being one of the greatest albums of all time, and I get that. I get it more on the merit of it's an excellent concept album / song cycle. I think it's unparalleled in that way, probably a lot because of what Tim talked about. It feels organic and not contrived, and it totally makes sense that he wrote this in 3 weeks because a lot of the different songs, especially side one, have a sort of sameness to them. There's a lyric cohesion and emotional cohesion to it. Where I like sort of balk at the greatest album of all time is I think there's only 3 great songs on the album, which were the first 3 hits that were released, and those other bits I don't think stand up on their own. But the caveat being, they're not intended to be standing on their own, right? So the fact that it's an excellent greatest of all time song cycle is that I get. But, you know, I'm a song guy, and when I think of like greatest albums of all time, I think of albums that have all these songs that stand on their own, that are all excellent, that cohere together, but it's like there's no, you know, tracks you would skip on the album, which is a totally weird analogy to make for this album because there's still no tracks you would skip. But my thought is, I don't think a lot of those things stand on their own. They stand as part of the cohesive whole, and they're brilliant. And it's like the best album like that I've ever heard. But that's all. My 2 cents.
Yeah.
I think when I think of it as the greatest album of all time, probably partly a product of me growing up at that time. It paints and a fascination that I have with that time period as well. It paints a picture of what it was like in urban cities in America
Yes.
at that particular time.
Yes.
I listen to this album, I can close my eyes on the couch and it just takes me back to, you know, Los Angeles in 1972. And though I did not live in the ghetto, I had friends who did. A lot of my friends did. And it I maybe I can't even explain it. I just I have never heard any album by in any genre of music by anyone that just hits me the way this album does. I think it's a perfect album. I think your observation is fair that the tunes that are not hits don't necessarily stand on their own, but I think
They
as you
don't
also
have to.
observed, they don't have to.
They don't have to, and that's just my bias too. But yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Hey, one
Um,
thing. Oh, sorry, Tim. Did I step on you?
oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
One thing we haven't mentioned that one of the things that got Marvin going in this direction was his brother coming back from Vietnam, and contextually within the culture, 71 was also the year of the Pentagon Papers, if I'm not mistaken, which was an expose of the government cover-up of the Vietnam War going back to like Harry Truman. Like every president was it Harry Truman? For sure Eisenhower. Almost every president between World War II and 1971 was covering up what was going on in the Vietnam War, and that got released to the public by the New York Times and then later the Washington Post in 1971, if I'm not mistaken. This was the Daniel Ellsberg thing.
Yeah, you are
And so,
correct, but it was actually after this album. So that
yes,
happened
yes,
in June of this year. Yeah.
but the Vietnam War and the fallout of that was very much in the zeitgeist. And I don't know at the time if anybody knew it was partially inspired by his brother coming back from Vietnam, right? Because I think that's something Motown would probably want to hide. But that's definitely catching the zeitgeist, even if it's how do you say, subliminal for the listener, right? This was the vibe. Vietnam was going on, and just speaking only for myself, I was terrified. I mean, the Vietnam War ended when I was 13 or 14, but I was terrified as a young adult of getting drafted and getting sent to Vietnam. I ended up not registering for the draft until 1980, and I just want to explain the zeitgeist one more time. I'm going to stop. What was real tragic about the Vietnam War is that these people weren't volunteers. So when we talk about United States wars that are since then that are, you might think they're ill-advised and we shouldn't have gone and done it, those were all volunteer armies. So the Vietnam War was not only an unjust war, it was a drafted bunch of folks out there, which meant it's a lot of black and brown faces and a lot of poor folks, right? Because you could get you get a deferment if you're wealthy, as our current president did. And, I think Creedence did a song called Senator's Son, right? So that zeitgeist, nobody knew about the Pentagon Papers, and that was going to apparently, happen later that year. But he was definitely, how do you say, connecting with something that was a real big deal and was only going to become a bigger deal later in that year.
I think it goes back before the release of the Pentagon Papers because the Vietnam War was an unpopular war, and Korea wasn't exactly the most popular war either in both cases. And so the war before that, the Great War, or the Second Great War, World War II, that was about saving the world. Korea and Vietnam, that was about those wars were about imperialism. And particularly among Black people, it was not popular war. Nobody wanted to go die in a war for that. But as you said, Black people, that was a choice they had to maybe get out of whatever horrible situation that they had at the time. But like Muhammad Ali famously said, there were no Vietnamese people were trying to kill me. It was Americans that were trying to kill me. Why would I go try to kill people who never wanted to do any harm to me, for people who did want to do harm to me? So I think the in the Black community, being anti-war just kind of came naturally, and the Pentagon Papers, that 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 played into what educated people had intuited about what was going on. But where this album is coming from, um, it was just from a Black man's perspective what Vietnam meant to that community.
Yeah. And I totally agree. And I would just emphasize that most of those Black people in the war were drafted. It wasn't their idea. They weren't volunteering.
I think it's very clearly stated that it's specifically Bloody Thursday that started off this album and his brother.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know about Bloody Thursday until I read about it.
I mean, yeah, I didn't know much about this album until I started reading about it.
But the perspective he has on this album is very much about Vietnam.
Yes, it is.
Mhm.
I think pretty specifically about Vietnam, and then like if other social issues outside of Mercy Mercy Me, which is I think just about ecology. But
One of the first popular songs about ecology, if I'm not mistaken, because that wasn't really a big deal back in the early 70s. It became a deal later.
That's not true. It was becoming a big deal at the time. I mean, the whole reason that Nixon did one of the good things that he did, creating the EPA, came out of environmental awareness that was that kind of built off of Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring, which I think came out in 1960. I want to say 64 or 66 was when Silent Spring came out.
Oh,
and
yeah.
that's the whole environmental movement in this country. And by the 70s, we had the advertisements, the famous picture of the garbage on the freeway and the Indian with the tear running down his face.
Also Earthrise from the Apollo program.
Yeah. Yes. That also played a part in that. So that was all part of all the problems that that Marvin was talking about that were on his mind, when he did this album. It was all, I don't think I don't purport to speak for him, but I don't think these were all separate things to him. This was his perspective of an entire world that was collapsing, because of our sins.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We are coming up on an hour here, so I do want to make sure that we cover anything that anybody else wants to, any pressing matters people need to talk about in regards to this album.
No, I love it. I think it's probably the best concept album ever, and certainly only getting competition from something like Dark Side of the Moon.
I'll have to keep finding like concept albums that you've never heard of and like put this to the test.
There you go.
All right. Well, on that note, then I'm going to end the stream for the night. But thank you guys for joining me. I really, really enjoyed listening to this album, and I can't wait to listen to the next one with you guys.
For those of you listening, it's a great, great album. Go listen to it. Try to listen to it on vinyl, because doing it on YouTube, it's weird. It's just
that's fair.
Cut up and jagged.
Yeah, I imagine anything that's going to cut up this album is going to like take away from.
Oh, you know what? I didn't spend a lot of time. You can probably find a full album, like one video of it, maybe on YouTube. That's the LP. That would be
probably still split up by ads, but I would suggest finding this in a way where you're not going to get it split up.
I would also suggest that the sound is probably not great on YouTube. If you can, if not vinyl, get a copy of the deluxe CD edition.
Yeah.
Listen to it from start to finish. No interruptions.
I don't think there's never been a time since, I don't know, the late 70s where I did not own a copy of this album in some form or another. It's the greatest album ever recorded, period.
There you go. That's a good way to end it.
Yeah.
Thank you for picking it. I just love this album.
This is really a Tim month here.
Yeah, when you picked Ron, I couldn't believe it.
There you
All
go.
right. Well, I'll talk to you about Ron on Monday. So
Sunday?
Monday.
Oh, Monday. Okay.
Yeah. All right. Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.